I wanted to come up with a new end-grain cutting board design, and I needed to get rid of some scrap wood, so I grabbed some maple, cherry, and walnut off the shelf and started cutting things into strips. I hadn't fully decided on what my design was going to be, but I knew I wanted to do a diamond pattern, so I needed to get everything down to a ½ inch thick. Some of the thicker pieces I took over to the bandsaw to resaw, and hopefully this is the last time you'll see me struggling with this old Craftsman bandsaw. Finally, I got everything down to the final thickness over at the planer. My wife made a comment on one of my earlier videos about how effective my shop apron was hanging on the wall behind me, so I thought maybe I would try wearing it again, just to keep the glue off my clothes, but we'll see how long that lasts. I glued everything up in 4 sections, making sure to keep the same pattern on all of them, with the walnut on the outside, the cherry and the maple on the inside, and I used wax paper in between to make sure they didn't stick together. In the morning, I carefully ran them through the joiner to square up one edge and then got my final thickness with the drum sander. I don't like running things through the planer like this because you just never know which direction the grain's running in the middle, and tear out is a big problem, so the drum sander does a much better job of getting things down to thickness without tearing them up. Then I used the crosscut sled that I made in the last video to square up the ends. Then I could lay out the diamond pattern on the end and move over to the table saw to cut these out. I've had this table saw for over 20 years and it's always been a great saw, but the one problem I do have with it is this right side tilt. It almost makes you work backwards because the fence has to be on the left side to avoid binding, but we make it work. I ran all the pieces through the table saw, cutting the 45-degree angle and leaving them a little bit big so I could come back later and screw things up. After cutting 45 on 3 sides of the boards, I was able to square my blade back up. I could run them through one more time on the flat side to get a final square shape. Then I went back to the drum sander to get the final dimensions. Now you can finally get a little bit of an idea of how we're going to turn all these straight strips into a diamond pattern. I glued these up in 2 sections, making sure not to glue them all together by accident, and let it sit overnight again. I resawed some Paduke to make some accent pieces on my new to me Jet 18-inch bandsaw, which even with a worn out blade was so much better than using the old Craftsman. With all my accent pieces cut, it was time to glue everything together with the angled pieces that I had glued up earlier. In the morning, I pulled everything out of the clamps, but I had actually decided overnight that I wanted to run a walnut border all the way around, so I glued up this last little piece before I could move on to the next step. Once the glue dried on the border pieces, of course, it was back to the drum sander for more flattening. At this point, I have to be very careful not to sand too far because I will screw up the diamond pattern. After everything was flat, I moved back to the table saw with the crosscut sled, squared up an edge. Then I set my stop block and started ripping off the pieces that would form our end grain cutting board. End grain boards could be a bit of a brain bender because you really can't see the pattern that you're working on until you get to this one step. This is where we get to flip things up on end and finally start to put the design together. One of the most critical glue ups in this piece is the final glue up, because if you don't get all these lines straight, then the whole thing kind of turns out to be a mess. So what I like to do is get a little bit of pressure on them, start the clamps a little bit, and then go back through and make sure everything is lined up from one end to the other. Then put the final pressure down, check everything again. If need be, I'll loosen things up and move things around a little bit. And of course, one last pass through the drum sander to get everything down smooth. Over to the table saw to square things up, and then it was on to several hours of sanding to finish things up. I start everything off with 80 grit, move up to 120, then I'll water pop, do 120 again, move up to 180, water pop again, run through 180 again, and then we'll move over to the router table to take care of some of the detail work. Over at the router table, I use an 1/8 inch roundover bit to ease all my corners off. Then I use a bowl and tray bit to make my handles, and then finally use a round nose bit to make my juice groove. After hand sanding all the fine details, I move back to the random orbital sander with some 220 grit, another water pop, and then finish everything off with 320 grit for a glass-like finish. And now for the part everybody loves, we're going to drop this in a bath of mineral oil, let that soak up quite a bit, then we'll put it in the drying rack over the weekend. After that, I'll come back, wipe on a good heavy coat of our board butter, wax, and conditioner, and this thing will be ready to use. All right, all the sanding is finally done. We've got some oil and wax on this thing. I think it turned out pretty good considering I was kind of making it up as I went along, just using up some scrap wood. So if you're still here at this point, I'm assuming you either like what you're watching or maybe you fell asleep, but hopefully it's the first one. If it is, get down there and hit that subscribe button for me and let YouTube know that we're doing a good job. And we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.